Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video where we are going to explore a brand new YouTube channel today. This one's called Geohistory. It showed up in my suggested videos today, and I watched the first couple of minutes, just enough to get an understanding, and I thought it was a really cool take on history to do so from the standpoint of looking at a map and looking at it this way. Haven't checked out too many of their other videos yet because I want to save those in case I do more reactions, but I'll put a link in the description to this particular original video so you can check out their original content. This one here is the European Conquest of America. So basically we're talking about the time of exploration and then conquest by the European powers of North and South America. So it's about a 17-minute video, so we're going to watch this, and I'll jump in from time to time just to kind of add my own thoughts. And obviously there's going to be some more background to this than what they're going to explore. As with any video, please make sure you check out the original content creator, give them a like, and make sure you support them. We don't want to piggyback off their work without giving them due credit for that. So with that said, let's check this out, and this coming week you can be expecting two things specifically. Part 2 of my look at Reconstruction on Forgotten History, and also the next couple of chapters of our look at the history of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. So those will be coming soon. Here we go. Let's dive into this one.
In the 15th century, these are approximately the known lands in Europe. To the east are the Indies, from where spices and silk come. In Europe, the trade of these luxury products is controlled by the powerful republics of Genoa and Venice. But in 1453, the Ottomans seize Constantinople and bring down the Byzantine Empire. By extending their influence over the Mediterranean, they put an end to the golden age of the Italian republics.
This is something really super important in discussing all of this, because this is not something that gets talked about a whole lot. Typically, the story of the exploration and conquest of the Americas, at least as it's taught in schools here, at least from what I can remember, it's been a long time since I was in school, but starts with Christopher Columbus and looking for another way to get to the Indies. But we don't really talk about why that is. This is why that is. Exploration that leads to the discovery, or the rediscovery, we should say, of the Americas really is born out of necessity. It's about trying to find another way to get to the spice trade without having to go through the Ottoman Empire and the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. They're trying to find another route to do that.
In the West, Portugal dreams of opening a new trade route to the Indies and seizing the monopoly on the spice trade. They take advantage of the development of the caravel, a more robust ship capable of handling the oceans, to send explorations to Africa.
And this is another important point, is it's not only necessity of trying to find another way with the trade, it's also the availability of new technology that makes this possible. You know, you got to remember, and we've talked about this in other videos, that for the most part throughout all of human history, you've had to stay close to land where you could see land. Not only because of navigation, because you don't have a way of navigating in open water, which they've also developed a way to deal with that about this time, but also because you just don't have the technology to have ships that can handle the rough open seas and carry enough supplies to get you where you need to go. So this is kind of the sweet spot of necessity and technology and all of that coming together at the right moment in history.
In 1484, Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator living in Lisbon, proposes to the Portuguese king to try to reach Asia by sailing west. According to his calculations, Cathay and Cipango, currently China and Japan, are close enough for the crossing to be feasible.
Don't let anyone tell you, I don't know if they still teach this to people, but Christopher Columbus was not unique in believing the world was round. By this point, we had known the world was round for a really long time. It goes back to at least to the ancient Greeks, that they knew that the world was round. So we've known the world was round for a good 2,000 years at this point. So that's not new. The issue was, how far is it to go that way to get to Japan, China, the spice trade, the Indies, things like that? And is there anything in the way in between? The issue was whether or not it was feasible to do that, not whether or not, there was a way around the other side.
But the king rejects the project. Confident, Christopher Columbus tries his luck with the rival Queen of Castile, but in vain. 2 years later, while Portugal reaches the Cape of Good Hope, the Spanish monarchy completes the Reconquista by seizing Granada. Nothing seems to stop its ambitions. It must now catch up with Portugal in its race towards the Indies.
So Castile and Aragon still separate kingdoms at this point. It's not combined into Spain quite yet. So you have Ferdinand and Isabella, who are the king and queen of these two nations, and they've married and they have children together. One of their daughters is Catherine of Aragon, who will go on to, who famously, not too long after this, marries Henry VIII of England. First marries his brother Arthur, and then later marries Henry VIII. And so, those two countries will be united eventually under King Charles V, who will also be the Holy Roman Emperor.
The Queen of Castile and the King of Aragon authorize and finance the expedition of Christopher Columbus. On August 3, 1492, Christopher Columbus leaves Palos with 3 ships and 90 men. After a short stopover in the Canary Islands, they head west and sail for 36 days into the unknown. The crew finally see an island. Columbus lands and meets with the local Taino people. Convinced he has reached the Indies, Christopher Columbus names them Indians. After a few exchanges, he leaves and explores the surrounding islands.
So, don't let people fool you when they say, first of all, that Christopher Columbus discovered America. We know that wasn't the true. We know that the Vikings and others had discovered North America long, long before this, many hundreds of years before this, and they had been back many times. And also, Christopher Columbus never set foot in what we would call North America, and on his initial trip didn't even set foot in South America. He landed on, I think the island's called San Salvador, is what he named it. He explores a little bit of Cuba and Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But that's really as far as he gets, at least on that first voyage.
Thinking he's in Asia, he looks for the kingdom of the Great Khan mentioned in the writings of Marco Polo. On an island called Quisqueya, which he renames La Hispaniola, he builds the Fort of the Nativity, leaves 39 men behind, and returns with 7 Tainos, gold, pearls, and parrots as proof of the success of his expedition. Welcomed as a hero, he returns to the Nativity a few months later, this time with 1,500 men, to found a permanent colony of which he would be the governor. But he finds the 39 men left behind dead. He then founds La Isabela in honor of the Queen of Castile and continues his explorations.
Obviously, we want to tell the whole story here. We need to recognize the fact that they immediately start oppressing these people. They start enslaving a lot of them. They start using their power over these people, and that's going to become a part of the story. So, this is a story of exploration and conquest, and obviously they're not going to tell every detail of everything that every person did. Yes, we can acknowledge Christopher Columbus did some really bad stuff. And on top of that, whether willingly or not, they bring diseases that the natives are not immune to, like smallpox, which just ravages them.
During this time, the Spanish monarchy in Portugal, to avoid conflicts around the newly conquered territories, agreed to draw a meridian. The lands to the east can be claimed by Portugal, those to the west by the Spanish monarchy.
And at this point, Spain's probably thinking this is a pretty good deal, right? Because they're figuring all the land they've found so far has all been to the west of that line. So as far as they are concerned, there's probably nothing over here but just empty water. They have no idea that South America is down here and sticks out really far, and that all of what will become Brazil is on the Portuguese side of the line.
Monarchy. England, in turn, begins to search for a new maritime route to India. An expedition is sent further north and reaches a land that is unknown to them. Vasco da Gama for Portugal crosses the Cape of Good Hope, enters the Indian Ocean, and reaches India on May 20th, 1498. A second Portuguese expedition leaves for India, but as it moves away from the coast to take advantage of the sea currents, the expedition reaches a new land.
And you know, how often in history do accidents turn into discoveries, right? And this is a perfect example of that. He's not looking for South America. He's not looking for this new continent and an extension of what they've already discovered. He's looking for a quick way to kind of slingshot around the Cape of Good Hope and get to that side. And in the end, he ends up discovering the coast of what will become Brazil.
Located east of the meridian of Tordesillas. There, an exotic wood grows from which can be obtained a red dye like an ember, or brasa in Portuguese.
Brazil.
This will later give the name of Brazil to their new colony. While the Spanish colonists discover products unknown in Europe, such as potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, and cocoa, ships loaded with gold, emeralds, and pearls return to Spain.
Think about that. Until this point in history, people in Europe, potatoes and tomatoes, not a part of their lives. Cocoa, not a part of their lives. Tobacco, these things that are part of everyday life now, were new discoveries to them that hadn't been found yet. But of course, what they're really after is not that stuff. They're after gold. They're after wealth. They're after gems. They're after slaves. They enslave people there, but then eventually, of course, the slaves from Africa.
Which motivates the departure of many colonists to the new Spanish lands. They bring with them domestic animals and seeds, but also diseases that were previously unknown to the indigenous populations, who are therefore not immune. These diseases spread throughout the continent faster than the colonists and decimate the populations.
See, understand that, even in Europe, diseases like smallpox would ravage the population, but it didn't do quite the damage to the population that it does to the natives, because generations of immunity have been built up. So, it's kind of like the idea of natural selection, right? You've built up a natural immunity. The woman that you're married to builds up a natural immunity. You pass some of that on to your kids. And so just through generations of experiencing these outbreaks of these pandemics and overcoming them, there's a natural immunity that's built up among the population, herd immunity, if you will. They don't have that over here. But the same thing's true in reverse. I want to say diseases like syphilis were unknown to Europe, but were brought to Europe from the natives. So it kind of works both ways.
In 1506, after a fourth trip, Christopher Columbus dies. A few months later, the word America appears on a map in honor of the explorer Amerigo Vespucci. The continent would henceforth be called America. In the Spanish territories, colonists...
Notice, it's really South America that first gets called America. At least as an American, in the United States, when we talk about America, we're usually talking about our country. But America first applied to Central and South America. And, if you go to Central America today, at least when I was there 20 years ago, they refer to us as North Americans, to distinguish from South Americans and, Central Americans. So the term America means a very different thing depending on where you are.
Impose forced labor on the local populations. But the Spanish monarchy, influenced by the Roman Catholic Church, opposes the mistreatment and tries via new laws to increase its control over the new territories and to improve the conditions of the natives. The Catholic Church also sends missionaries to evangelize the local populations. From the Spanish colonies, conquerors called conquistadors explore everywhere. To the north, they discover a land they name Florida.
And Ponce de Leon is going to be looking for the legendary Fountain of Youth, that whole story with things like that. This is all, think about this, this is all really in a span of 25 years or so that all of this has happened. Everyone's understanding of the map of the world is changing by the minute, changing by the year. every year new discoveries are being made, new lands are being made, which means new opportunities for wealth, new opportunities to conquer. And these conquistadors are going to go in, and it's not very long between when they're saying with the Catholic Church, hey, we want to get along with these people, we want to treat them right, to where conquistadors are going to go in and say, how can we very quickly defeat the natives that are here? And I think it starts with the Aztecs.
To the south, an expedition goes inland and discovers a sea on the other side.
Pacific Ocean.
Finally, in 1518, an expedition goes north along the coast, passes a peninsula, and meets representatives sent by an emperor. The governor then decides to send a mission there.
And I'm sure they're not going to get into too much detail on this, but it's pretty horrible how they take down Montezuma and the Aztecs.
The conquistador Hernán Cortés leaves Cuba in 1519. On his way, he recovers a Spanish shipwrecked man who survived 8 years in Mayan country, and then he obtains a mistress after a confrontation. Both will assist him as interpreters. Once on dry land, he understands that he is in the Aztec Empire, whose capital, Tenochtitlan, controls the surrounding regions.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs originate as a nomadic tribe in northern Mexico. They arrive down more in Central America. They found Tenochtitlan, which is this incredible capital city. It's one of the jewels of the Americas at this point. And unfortunately, it very quickly is brought down by Cortés. But just some of the lasting effects of what they did here. When the Aztecs saw an eagle perched on a cactus on the marshy land near the southwest border of Lake Texcoco, they took it as a sign to build their settlement there. They drained the swampy land. That's no small achievement. Constructed artificial islands on which they could plant gardens and establish the foundations of their capital city in 1325. And so they grow maize, which is corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, avocados. Just incredible things that they're doing here. At their height, the city of Tenochtitlan has 140,000 people. By the early 16th century, the Aztecs rule over 500 tiny states, some 5 to 6 million people. This is an incredible kingdom. I mean, that's a significant population. And, just some of the things that they leave behind today. I mean, some of our words come from them. Things like chili, avocado, chocolate, coyote, peyote, guacamole, ocelot. I mean, these are words that we still use today, even in the English language, that come from the Aztecs. The Aztecs worshipped many gods, including the god of war and of the sun, a feathered serpent. They have a calendar, which is based on a solar cycle of 365 days. Very educated people, completely cut off from the Western world, but still developed a rich culture and a rich education, rule over a large area. But of course, just by 1520, smallpox has reduced their population just of the capital city by 40% in 1 year. And so when Cortés comes along, they're already pretty well devastated, and they're ripe for conquest.
Impressed by the firearms and horses they've never seen before, some of the people choose to join the Spanish crown. Cortés is guided to Tenochtitlan, where the emperor welcomes him peacefully. At the same time, to the south of the continent, Ferdinand Magellan, who's also trying to reach the Indies to the west, passes through a strait that will one day bear his name and enters a new ocean that is unknown to him.
And to this day, this is a brutal place to go by ship. It is not easy, and even on the best of conditions, it can be an absolutely brutal area. And many, many ships throughout the centuries and many, many lives have been lost going through the Straits of Magellan.
In Tenochtitlan, a war breaks out between the Aztecs and Cortés, who had been chased out of the capital. He allies with the rebels and enemies of Tenochtitlan, then besieges the city and cuts off its drinking water supply. But the inhabitants suffer above all from smallpox, which decimates the city. After 75 days of siege, Tenochtitlan collapses, and Cortés becomes the governor of New Spain.
Now, one of the things that Cortés does at one point on one of his conquests is when he lands in what is now Mexico, he has his men burn their ships. And burning your ships has actually come down as kind of this metaphor for no turning back. And that's what he was trying to accomplish with that. He wanted them to be singularly focused on their mission, which is basically, we either accomplish this or we die. There's no freaking out, getting scared, and going back to Spain because there's no ships anymore. And so that's kind of become a metaphor. When you burn your ships, when you burn everything, there's no turning back. You can only move forward.
Despite strong resistance, the Spaniards continued to extend their control in Central America. Spain, which is indebted to German bankers, authorizes them in return to found a colony in an area where houses are built on stilts and which is then named Little Venice, or Venezuela.
And there's something you don't hear about much either. Little Venice, Venezuela. It's very interesting how some of the names that we just assume have always been first came to be.
To the south, an expedition goes inland, and rumors circulate about a certain Peru kingdom. The navigator Francisco Pizarro then leaves to search for it. He lands and learns that he's in the Inca Empire, which is in a full war of succession. After several contacts by intermediate embassies, a meeting is organized in Cajamarca with the Emperor Atahualpa. But the meeting degenerates, and Pizarro arrests the emperor. 9 months later, in spite of the enormous gold and silver ransom received for his liberation, Pizarro executes Atahualpa and then seizes Cusco, the capital of the empire.
And this, this is an empire that's a lot of it's up in the Andes Mountains. It's difficult terrain, but just look how quickly Spain just shows up and just wipes out empires, executes emperors, takes control of these places. It's, in one way, I don't want to use the word impressive because there's nothing impressive about murder and conquest necessarily, but it is impressive how quickly they do these things and how quickly they can come in and take down empires that have built up. And like with the Aztecs, 5 or 6 million people, and just like that, the Spanish take them over.
While strong rivalries appear between the colonists who want to monopolize the Inca wealth, in the north of Tomebamba, a pocket of Inca resistance is organized around the general Rumanahui. But finding himself in a difficult situation, he decides to burn Quito and to hide all the Inca wealth. Captured and tortured, he does not reveal the location of this treasure, which, if it exists, has never been found. Further south, Pizarro founds a capital, the City of Kings, which later will become Lima. In 1536 in Cusco, the Incas rebel and take the city. Almagro, Pizarro's ally, who returns from unsuccessful conquests in the south, takes the city and proclaims himself governor of Cusco. A war breaks out between Pizarro and Almagro. Taking advantage of the chaos, the Incas found the kingdom of Vilcabamba, which will resist the Spaniards for 36 years. Further south, a group of populations called the Mapuches also firmly resist the Spanish intrusions. In the north, Spain continues to enlarge its territory considerably. The priest Bartolomé de las Casas denounces the cruel treatments imposed on the natives. Spain, in 1542, passes new laws in order to return freedom to the slaves by abolishing the encomienda and by affirming equality of the rights of the natives.
So this is a pretty progressive thing. Now, again, we're still talking just 50 years after Columbus first lands in these areas, New Granada, San Salvador, places like that. And so this is all within a relatively short period of time. There were plenty of people who were alive when this began and who are alive still when all this takes place. So you have to give credit to some of these people who are willing to speak up on behalf of the natives, because there probably weren't many people in Spain who were on their side.
In Peru, these laws are very badly received by the colonists. The viceroy tries to make them apply, but a revolt breaks out and he is beheaded. Spain finally manages to regain control of the region and suspends the conquests in America, although many populations still resist Spanish colonization. In Europe, new powers are interested in the riches of America. France, which does not recognize the Treaty of Tordesillas, sends expeditions to Brazil. The colony of France Antarctique is founded there. Annoyed by the new competition, the Portuguese destroy the colony in 1560.
Ouch.
They then develop colonization by sending expeditions deep inland in search of mines and slaves.
And this is some brutal ground. I mean, we're talking about the Amazon rainforest in here, and this is not an easy place to just go exploring. And it's huge. I mean, this is a massive, Brazil is a huge country.
England also has its eye on America. Irritated by the commercial monopoly that Spain is establishing in the Pacific Ocean, the Queen of England secretly finances an expedition by Francis Drake, who
Elizabeth
plunders
I.
Spanish wealth on the Pacific coast. Further north, Drake founds New Albion in the name of the English crown before heading west to return to England.
So isn't it interesting that he founds a colony in what is now California? And Francis Drake is also one of the people who will, in 1588, help lead the British Navy, the English Navy, against the Spanish Armada in that famous battle that defeats Spain's attempt to invade England.
At the same time, the Spanish monarchy takes over Portugal. The United Provinces, quickly followed by England, take advantage of this and try to seize the trade routes and the Portuguese colonies. In South America, further inland, a region little explored by the Spaniards and the Portuguese attracts the covetous. For a century, the myth of El Dorado, the city
of
filled
gold,
with gold, has been widely circulated. This attracts hundreds of European settlers who devastate the region in search of gold, igniting the fury of local populations. This does not prevent the arrival of French, Dutch, and British Protestants who flee Europe in search of lands far from Catholic influences.
And to this day, you can see that. Let's take a look at the map real quick. So there you have it. There you have, you can already see, Venezuela was founded up here. You've got Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. These are those little colonies that were set up by the Western European powers that for most of the next 400 years will still be controlled by them. And it's only in the last couple of generations that has changed.
To the north, the coasts of Newfoundland, rich in fish, are frequented by many fishermen from all over Europe. As early as 1603, France finances new expeditions to explore Acadia and to found a first settlement at Port Royal. Despite conflicts with the local populations, fishing and fur trading develop. Further south, England founds Jamestown, its first permanent colony.
Now, before this, a little further south than that, there had been set up the colony of Roanoke, kind of out on the outer banks of North Carolina, and it lasted for a couple years. Long story, and at some point we'll do an entire video talking about what they call the lost colony of Roanoke, because it's a fascinating story. The whole thing with what happened to those colonists when they were taken inland. Did they survive? There's these things called the Dare Stones that may be a hoax. Some of them probably definitely are a hoax. Others may be real. There's a really fascinating story that definitely deserves its own video at some point. But yeah, Jamestown is the first permanent colony, and it barely hangs on by a thread, kind of like what will happen with Plymouth 13 years later.
But while the French accelerate colonization with the creation of Quebec, the English attack Acadia. From then on, the two countries and their respective local allies are constantly fighting over the region. After founding New Amsterdam on an island, the Dutch negotiate with the locals to purchase Manhattan Island in exchange for some goods equivalent to 60 florins, which is currently worth about a few $100s. Also in the south, the Dutch expand their possessions and take over a large part of Brazil. But in 1640, Portugal regains its independence and recovers its territories. The Dutch are expelled and concentrate their efforts in the north of the continent by absorbing New Sweden. At the same time,
And these are things people don't talk about much. I think it's fairly well known that the Dutch first held New York City, and you can go there today and see still some of the influence of New Amsterdam being there. And of course, New Sweden's less known, but there were a lot, and I descend from some of the Swedish colonists who founded the area right around what is today Philadelphia, which is where New Sweden was. Some of my Swedish ancestors, that's where they lived. But yeah, Sweden's there. The United Provinces, which is, the Dutch, they're there, but they lose most of it. Eventually, it kind of becomes England and France, and then eventually just England when the French and Indian War happens.
British take Jamaica from the Spaniards to develop the sugar trade. They also obtain permission to exploit wood on the coast of New
Belize.
Spain. The growing commercial rivalry between the United Provinces and England provokes a war that turns to the advantage of the British. At the peace treaty, the United Provinces cede their North American territories and recover Suriname, which was occupied by the British. New Amsterdam becomes New York. In the West Indies, mainly the French and the British take over islands from the Caribs in order to develop large sugar plantations that require a large workforce.
The Caribs, it's where you get the word the Caribbean Sea. And of course, here now, this is where slavery is first going to become essential to the economy. In fact, by the time you get to the middle of the 1700s, if you live anywhere in this part of the world, your life is significantly impacted in some way by slavery and by the slave trade, whether you are actively involved with it and own any slaves yourself or not. But these sugar plantations are completely made possible because of the slave trade.
European merchants leave for the African coasts where they buy slaves. These are then transported to America to be sold in the mines or on the plantations. Their life expectancy is about 7 years. The ships then return to Europe loaded with precious metals and luxury goods.
So you would think, on one hand, that, okay, the life expectancy of a slave is about 7 years because of these brutal conditions. You would think that would make them financially unfeasible, right? You're investing all this money just to have them die. No, all it does is make you go get more slaves. And so it just makes the slave trade that greater in demand. And I've talked about this before, and you've heard me emphatically say that it absolutely does not matter who sold these slaves into slavery. And I should explain that a little better. I understand that there are people that want to blame white Europeans for the slave trade, and that the reason behind people going out of their way to say, hey, but those African slaves were sold to those white Europeans by other Africans. That's true. And to have a complete understanding of history, we need to acknowledge that. My only point in saying that is that for those slaves, it didn't matter. They were in bondage and taken to another continent. And it didn't much matter to them who was responsible. It just mattered that it happened. And that's something we'll also cover at some point. The slave trade itself is something we probably should talk about. It was pretty brutal. Just beyond the whole part of being enslaved. Just the conditions and how many of them died on the trip. And it's absolutely brutal.
In the 17th century, this model becomes so profitable that the slave trade explodes, as does piracy, which flourishes in the Caribbean. Many people are opposed to slavery, notably the Jesuits, who found communities throughout America to protect the natives from the colonists. They are evangelized and work for the communities, which quickly become rich, but Spain and Portugal will eventually expel them. In the north of the continent, while the British found Philadelphia, the French, after an expedition, claim Louisiana and then expand along the rivers to link it to New France. New France then signs a peace agreement with 39 nations, mainly Iroquois. Fearing that they would be surrounded, the British attack Acadia again and rename it Nova Scotia.
New
The
Scotland.
latter, together with Rupert's Land and Newfoundland, are officially annexed in the treaties of Utrecht, which end the War of Spanish Succession. Spain and the United Provinces are weakened. Great Britain is now a great maritime and commercial power. In 1733, it founds Savannah, which stops the Spanish expansion from Florida.
And keep in mind, while all of this is going on, while these European powers claim these lands, there are millions of Native Americans living in these places who don't have any clue that somebody else is making claims on their land. Because for the most part, even though on a map, for example, France has drawn up the Louisiana territory as theirs, they don't occupy most of this. They're claiming it, but they're mostly just traders and trappers in this area that by and large get along with the natives. They're not conquering this land, not yet.
From Russia, a Danish captain named Vitus Bering leads mapping expeditions on behalf of the Tsar. After exploring the strait that now bears his
Bering
name,
Strait.
Bering sights in 1741 the coasts of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, where he dies. The abundance of prey on these islands attracts many Russian hunters. The Russians gradually move along the coast to develop the otter fur trade. In the Ohio Valley, tensions rise between the French and the British, who are fighting over control of the region. A war begins, which at first turns to the advantage of the French.
And who's the one who kind of kicks that all off in the Ohio Valley? A young man named George Washington, who is leading troops in this area down around modern Pittsburgh, where the French have a fort, Fort Duquesne. And that's kind of where it all gets started, is right down there in this area around Pittsburgh. And that's, again, a story for another day.
Great Britain then decides to deport en masse the French-speaking Acadians still present in Nova Scotia. Many die on the way. The survivors are scattered throughout the British colonies. In Europe, the 7 Years' War breaks out. Great Britain, which dominates the seas with its powerful Royal Navy, imposes a maritime blockade on the French colonies, which, without reinforcements, fall into the hands of the British.
When you have colonies that are thousands of miles away, you've got to be able to win the naval war. And the naval war is what makes the difference. Even though a lot of it's fought on land, here in America we call it the French and Indian War. It's part of the larger 7 Years' War, which is also taking place in Europe and the Caribbean and elsewhere. But it's the British Navy that make the difference here.
In 1763, in the peace treaty signed in Paris, France gives up most of its American colonies. Spain receives the western part of Louisiana in exchange for Florida. Great Britain dominates all its rivals. But the war has weighed on its finances, and it intends now to take advantage of its many colonies to replenish its coffers by imposing new taxes.
But of course, that's a story for another day as well. That's the American Revolution, which, again, that's something we can talk about sometime. It's not really a revolution. It's a war for independence, but it's not a revolution. They're not trying to overthrow the British government. They're just trying to form their own government. So funny how we name things sometimes. But let me know what you guys think of that map and of that channel. And if you guys like it and seem to respond well to it, we'll look at some more of their videos down the road. There's more to this story, of course, and what comes next, the Revolutionary War, decolonization of America, things like that. But use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts. Hit that like button if you would. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.